not gonna talk about, but just bear with me with the subject today. This is supposed to be a quick session directly to a few of you before the big training coming up later on. And today we're going to talk about federation as a feature offered by Centrify. I'm going to share my screen 2. Okay, can you guys see my screen in Centrify portal?
Yeah, we can see.
Yes. Okay, so this is what we did last time, right? Centrify as an IDP configured a SAML application to a service provider, in this case, Sumo Logic. Now, so that's what we did. That's the most simplified diagram that could ever be drawn, right? Now, federation is the opposite. And I like to think of it as Centrify as service provider, right? And what that means is instead of Centrify being the IDP, a setup or more so a customer somehow actually have already a user store of their own, even more so an IDP on top of it already. So the business scenario becomes Centrify as a service provider, but the user, we do have user that likes our applications and features that we provide, but then the authentication has been delegated to their own IDP. So we needed something to do SAML single sign-on, but in the opposite way. And therefore, the solution made was named federation. And the diagram is going to look like this. Now, for example, and this scenario is actually real, and it has come up, and that's actually one of the scenarios that Gordon specifically is asking for. That's what I'll be talking about later on, is Centrify as an IP, Centrify as an SP, Idaptive tenant is an IDP. So we'll be doing, if from Centrify side, then that will be a SP initiative single sign-on, go to Idaptive, and then Idaptive will send a SAML response back to Centrify, then the user will be authenticated as a federated user. It started with a federated user. Okay, so how is that set up? So now I have two portals, Centrify on the left side and Idaptive on the right side. Before looking at the IDP side, let me show you the federation setup. It's actually known as partner management in portal. So you go to settings, users, because this is related to users, partner management, then this is where the partner IDP are being configured. So let me delete this one. That was my test run before. So remember the information exchange that I talked about last session, right? With something that service provider sent to IDP and vice versa. So in this case, Centrify as an SP, we will be sending some information out. So the first thing on this screen is to set up a partner name. For this session, I'm just going to call it a demo IDP. And there's only one federation type right now, so you don't have to touch that really. But if you do, this is SAML 2 we are dealing with. Federation domain is actually the user domain. So imagine after all this is set up, when a user enter the username in Centrify login screen, then that username's domain will be used to find a configuration here and redirect the user to IDP, which you'll see in a bit. Right now, let me just call this demo IDP. You don't need to add there, actually. Now, if you click Save, you will see this message. It says you must provide some information from the IDP side. Okay, so it is asking for the information exchange. But that does not happen in the screen. So if you click save right now, it won't let you. It is actually in inbound data. Now, group mapping is an optional setting. So let's not touch that right now, right? Like I always say, until the basic single sign-on works, any optional settings, advanced settings, there will be no chance to succeed. So let's leave that out for now. Inbound metadata. So this is where we take in, that's why inbound, and a metadata from IDP. And kind of like our SAML application, right, as an IDP, it offers you different options depending on how IDP gives out a metadata. For option 3, if it is just piece by piece coming out, then you would manually enter here, piece by piece. So in this case, we have to go to IDP at this point. Because you actually, once you get here, right, and it's asking for input, you actually cannot go anywhere else, which is okay. Then this is the time that we go to Idaptive side. Now, of course, this looks very similar to the Centrify portal. So now if you have another tenant to serve as an IDP in this case, either it is Centrify or Idaptive, you go to App Catalog, and then you look for a SAML application's name B2B. In Idaptive tenant is going to name Idaptive B2B. On Centrify side is going to be Centrify B2B. In this setup, we're doing Idaptive, so it's going to be Idaptive B2B. So give it a name that you can recognize. And I guess I could give a better logo for it too, so I know it is going to Centrify. Okay, so we saw the screen last time, but what we are doing here now is, so here's going down the service provider section that would actually come later. Right now, because SP, Centrify, is asking for IDP information, and it is capable of taking in metadata. So let's use metadata URL, copy it, paste over there. And when we click saves, it will go out, it will actually go out to this app. All right, at that URL and grab the information here. And now we have a new entry. But that's not the end yet, right? So that we have just finished giving information from SP to IDP. Now, IDP needs service provider information too, down here. And that is going to be in pretty much the same way, except this time we go to, from Centrify side, federation, outbound metadata, meaning we are giving the metadata outbound. So same thing, we can use the URL. And then on the IDP side, give in that URL. Click on load, and this is a queue that it goes to the URL, grab the contents, and this is the contents of that metadata. And then saving it. So as far as metadata exchange, that's it. Now, but now for an applications to work, we also need to set account mapping, like I mentioned last time. So by default, it is using a user principal name. Now, however, for a B2B SAML app, there's one thing special. Out of the box, it is actually using the user's user principal name. So it depends on the test user you're gonna use. You might have to modify this part. If your test setup will be also using user principal's name, then fine, you don't have to touch it. But what it does right now is it actually will not look at the result of the account mapping. It will always do this. So it'll be very careful of that. Now, if in doubt, you could always use the preview button to select your test user and actually look at the final username going out. So in this case, it's going to be in the SAML attribute name, user principal name. and that's the user principal name value coming out of that user. So let's leave everything default right now, and for this application, of course, do not forget to deploy the app so your test user have access and be able to launch it. For simplicity, I'm going to just choose everybody right now. Okay, then the applications on IDP is ready, and the exchange between service provider and IDP is also ready, and we are ready to make a test run. Now, before I do that, I want to show you the users I have in Centrify tenant. So right now, I only have 3 users. One's actually the cloud admin given to me. I made another one for myself, and then there's an 80 users that Gino has set up some Active Directory, have connectors on both tenants connecting to it, which we'll get to use later, but that's it, right? 3 users right now. So now I'm going to use another browser so I can keep the admin stuff separated in the background. I'm going to IDP, and I'm going to launch IDP initiative single sign-on. Okay, so for Centrify's federation, it supports both IDP initiative single sign-on and SP initiative single sign-on. And like I said, when that's the case, always test IDP initiative single sign-on first. Because if it doesn't work, then SP would not work either. And also, things are going to happen fast. So I'm going to turn on SAML tracer in case we need to see the traffic. And let me make sure this is the, yeah, so this is the new one I just configured. So now when I launch it, what's supposed to happen is it will, right, go to service provider, in this case, Centrify, and be logged into Centrify. Okay, so that, once again, happens quite fast. And just to show you the trace, we launched the app, send a SAML response to Centrify with the username of the user principal name of my user, which in this case is just tfog at 5126. And now I'm logged into Centrify. Now I probably don't have any permission assigned to me. That's why there's nothing to see here. And one way to confirm it from this portal, you can see the username, right? It is the username that I just showed you. But if you're still not sure if this is really like what user is this right now, right? Yeah, you could always go back to users list. That's why I wanted to show you earlier. Now, if there was not a user already exists with that username, Federation is going to create a new user on the fly. And this is the one, right? With that username I just showed you. Now it has a very specific type. If you look at source, it's Federation with the partner name that I gave. Federation with, in this case, demo IDP. And how did it get the other piece of information? Well, if you look at the SAML response, they're actually SAML attributes, right? That we kind of saw earlier. Then this is where the IDP send to Federation, right? Not just the username, user principal name, but also, if any, the display name, in a description. In this case, I don't have a description. Email address, first name, last name, was actually parsed from display name, phone number, additional information like that, right? Then Federation see this user and not seeing this user existing already, and will create a new one with those information. Okay, then that's the new user created by Federation. Now, next time, if I on the IDP side, change the user's display name or phone number, and then I do a federation again, then federation will actually update these information. Okay, so now IDP initiated single sign-on is working. Let me also show you SP initiated single sign-on.
Excuse me, Terry. When you say you did the federation again, actually you meant to say that you do login again, right?
Correct, correct.
Yeah.
So now you'll see I'm logging out everywhere.
Yeah, not the federation per se, but you try to do IDP initiated login again, right?
Yeah. Actually, this time I'm going to try SP, right? So remember, earlier we gave the domain just demo at IDP, right? This one right here. And you could add multiple, by the way. So how this is going to be used is if a user is in Centrify, is on Centrify login screen, and actually enter the domain of that you configured. So in this case, just demo IDP, not dead. Once again, I'll turn on the tracer. So Centrify will see that, hey, I have a partner IDP configured with that domain entered. And it will redirect the user to that partner IDP. And the user logs into the IDP, and the rest was the same as we saw before. That the IDP redirects the user back to SP as that federated user. Okay, so also good. Any questions?
Terry, you are going to cover the case of light federation, right? In that case,
yeah.
And that's especially, that's especially important because that is the use case that we have has with Idaptive, right? The use case.
Yes. Okay, you ready for this? If there's no more question, that's what I'm going to talk about next.
Oh wait, Terry, real quick.
Yeah.
So you logged into the service provider, and then it rerouted you to Idaptive, and then to the IDP, and then back to the SP. What part handled that? Was it both the B2B app, or was it the federation part of it? The handling, the rerouting back to.
The back to would be the SAML app on the IDP side. In this case, it is the B2B SAML app in Idaptive.
So the web app, right?
Yes. This guy.
If I may say, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Terry, the underlying mechanism is the same, it's just the direction is different, right? So, I mean, this is a relationship, federation relationship between an SP and IDP. So your SP initiated, meaning that you click or you try to use that application from SP side, versus IDP initiated, which is you are trying to use the application from the IDP side. And the underlying mechanism is the same, it's just a different direction.
Right. Oh, so the
Correct.
direction, I mean, like right now, an example, the bottom graph. So going from right to left is was the federated or the federation part of it, right? But rerouting you back from IDP back to the SP is the app.
Correct.
But it's only terminology, right? from SP point of view, correct me if I'm wrong, Terry, again. From SP side, you have a partner which is kind of the federation partner in terms of terminology. On the IDP side, you have an application, which in this case is Centrify, and it's a service provider. And you treat it as a web application, but underlying mechanism is still federation. It's just a matter of terminology, which is confusion, and I have been complaining about it for I don't know how long.
Okay, I'm just because I
go
guess to
ahead,
follow up with Nate's question. So like for when we do a split tenant, maybe I could ask this later just to not ruin your flow, but maybe I could just
that is what Terry is going to cover next, right? That's a live iteration.
Okay.
Yes. Okay, any more questions about this so far? I think everyone is really want to see the next one, right?
Yes.
Okay. So here's actually there are scenarios, also questions, and that's what you guys are asking for is, hey, there's an actual setup that, okay, Centrify connects to Idaptive, but partners up that way, SP and IDP relationship. But, instead of always federated user, right, can it be another different types? More so, we already, in some setup, in this case, your setup, right, you already have a common Active Directory connected already. So is there a way that for a user to go to Idaptive as an IDP and come back, can it be, just the same AD user? Or it's an AD user instead of a federated user? The question is, well, yes. That's why the light federation was made. And just a side note, on Idaptive side, we call this account linking. What that means is actually linking a user account from a federated user to an existing user. And that is made this way, this because, well, based on how the federation was already made, right? The user can come back as a federated user. So we keep that mechanism. I keep saying we, but it's actually not our team that implement that feature, but we were part of it. So when the user comes back as a federated user, we look up to the AD, which is the same in this case, right? If we can map a username, well, also user principal name by default to an AD user, then we are going to lock the user in as an AD user instead of making a new federated user or mapping it to a federated user. Okay, so that's the look of it. Here's the demo. Now, before we begin, so back to the user list, I showed you this 80 users earlier, right? So I'm going to use this one. And on the IDP side, I also have that user. All right, so now the goal is to, from IDP to Centrify, eventually I want the user map back to this one, right, instead of the new federated user. So now if you go back to partner management, the same partner IDP, Light Federation implements a new tab called authentication. Now, there are actually other stuff added to the same tab as well. But for basics, the first one we look at is actually this dropdown. By default, it's disabled. And now there's an optional and required. And let's start with required. And by default, it's using user principal name. It's the mapping attribute coming in, which is actually the same SAML attribute that we saw before. So we don't need to touch that unless you decide to change it. Then for directory user mapping attribute, this one means, okay, we look at the SAML attribute of user principal name. So in my example, I got tfog, right, at a something. How is that value going to map to a user? Is that going to be a name of a user or the UUID of a user? So generally speaking, actually, I don't have any statistics, but I would think typically we go by name, right? UUID is really like, you know the GUID of the username, then you will use that. Otherwise, it's going to be name. Preferred directory service. So this one will list out your existing directory service configured in Cloud Tenant. In this case, we are doing AD. So we choose AD. Now, there are other settings that I could talk more about. I honestly don't know all of them, but I have tried some of them that I can show you later on. So the minimum setup is just this, right? Again, we just turn on light federation by required or optional, using the default value, and it's going to, if a user principal name value is found and is able to map to a selected AD, then that user will be mapped to that AD user. So the setup is just that. And on the IDP side, it's actually, so for this example, I am going to use that user principal name. So going back to our B2B app. Right, so for my users, user principal name is not gonna be that AD username. So actually, would it? I was tempted to change this to the other one, but I think the better example is actually use the AD user. So let me try that. Okay, so I'm not changing IDP configuration. So I'm in another browser now. Instead of my cloud user, let me try this.
Excuse me, Terry. Would you mind showing the account mapping on the adaptive side before you go ahead? For the Centrify application, right? There's account mapping there, right?
Yes.
Would you mind showing that?
You want to see that right now?
Yes. Can I?
Of course.
Okay. Yeah. So this, I think this is critical, right? Yeah, it has to. Yeah, because for every application, as a user, when you log into that application or launch that application, it will go through this account mapping. And in this light federation, we would actually want to use the directory service field, right? Definitely not all users share one name or that kind of stuff, or even the mapping script, right? So the default should be good. That is what I'm trying to say. Okay.
And that's the tricky part. The default is made this way it is. However, because of the SAML script that ships out of the box, see, here's the thing. Federation uses the user principal name SAML attribute to get the username. Right. It does not use the name ID to get the username. That's why out of the box, it doesn't matter what you said in account mapping. Unless this is changed, Federation is not gonna look at the account mapping of this application.
That's right. That's the default, because the default kind of match, right? because nobody is going to look at this, this, cryptic stuff that you are looking at, right?
Normally, yes, but
Yeah.
I have to point it out just because you need to make sure your test user will have a user principal name. Otherwise, you will get an error message saying, actually, no, in that case, you will not. Right.
Yeah.
So yes, by default, you can leave it that way. You just need to make sure that your test user have a user principal name.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so based on what we just said, I'm actually gonna do this. Okay, so don't try this at home. This is just for demo training purposes. Instead of the user principal name of my user, I am going to give it the AD user that I know on the other side. Right, imagine normally if I log in as that AD user, then the user principal name would be the same. But now, I'm gonna take that little shortcut. So I'm gonna hard code it there.
So Terry, this will work only for one specific user.
This is exactly. That's why I don't try this at home. This is just a fast way to show you what is going to happen. Let me go through the login again. So now I'm logging in as the same user, but like you just spotted, because of that hard-coded configuration, when I launch that SAML app, B2B SAML app, see the SAML response, go to the user principal name SAML attribute. Now, instead of the tfog before, I have the hard-coded one send it out. Okay, so that is sent to federation. Now look at what happened. I'm logged in as a user, but I am that AD user now. I was hoping somewhere it would actually tell me here my user type. But once again, if in doubt, right, you can always go back to the user list to confirm that. Oh, we have seen this before. I am an AD user with that domain also. So that's the light federation happened already because we sent in, so after the configuration you saw, right, in partner management, in the authentication tab. All right, so now when IDP send in a user principal name that can be mapped to an AD user, it will be mapped to an AD user. So again, that's what the workflow had happened. The more breakdown to this was really just on the Idaptive side, right? Have the same AD that gets the AD user and then send the user principal name of that AD user to Centrify. Then Centrify Federation look at that user principal name based on the light federation configuration, look at AD to find an existing user, existing AD user specifically, found it, and then lock in the user as an AD user instead of the default federated user. Okay.
So Terry, I'm a little bit confused. So for these two light for this light federation to work, the default account mapping should just work by only adaptive side, because the partner management is done on the Centrify side, and that's pretty clear as you show. But going back to my earlier kind of question, on the IDP side, namely the adaptive side, there is account mapping for that Centrify app, right? And I believe that if you leave the account mapping to the default value, you should just work, right? So yeah. So if you don't touch it, and you don't need to manipulate that script, right? It should just work. Can you confirm that?
Yes.
Okay.
I can confirm that. In fact, I think that is the intention. That's why out of the box they match it that they are matched that way.
Right. So the admin does not have to modify this script, using the script editor to modify, right? The default account mapping on the adaptive side should just work for lightweight light federation. Okay, thank you. That's what I want to emphasize for the partner.
Yeah, that's correct. So only if you try to do something else more advanced and change it, then that's still just a mapping issue that can be worked out. But by default, it is set up that way. The only user principal name is used, map to a name, and just choose the directory service you want to map, and that's it.
Yeah. This is kind of a twisted logic, because in federation, basically, is you federate two different identity store or two different identity services. But in this case, we basically federated to ourselves, right? That's AD, because the customer has only one AD. Anyway, that's a side comment.
No, that's correct. That's actually the biggest part of this setup, right? And actually how light federation was made, because hey, we already have the same directory service. So let's make something to just map to the same user rather than federated user. Okay, so any other questions? If not, then I'll talk about two more little things. So now in case, if you ever want, instead of federated user, but you want a cloud user, right? And so there's this checkbox to create a cloud user if a user cannot be found. Now, what that means is, right, if I come in with a user principal name that cannot be mapped to an AD user, if you check this checkbox, then a cloud user will be created with that username. I don't know who asked for this feature, but that is an option, just so you know.
If I may, I think the use case is that on the adaptive side, you have cloud user. Also on the Centrify side, you have cloud users. And in this case, there are actually two different identity stores versus AD, which is common. So, and that's why this is needed, right?
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, good. Oh, and then when a cloud user is being used, so that's the first checkbox, is now for cloud user, by default, it does not automatically update the user's information, like the phone number that I just told you about. So this checkbox was made to, if you want that to also happen to cloud user, then you check this. So that's what the two checkboxes that I know how it works, and I want to mention it to you. Okay, so that's all I know about light federation so far and how to set them up.
Thank you very much.
So Terry, now you made the changes to use the user principal name. Will it work? Can we see? Because before it was hard-coded name.
It will still work. Yeah, I suppose you want me to try with the AD user.
Yeah, AD user and use the user principal name.
Keep this guy up here. The only thing with this is, I'm not sure if I remembered my password. It's got to be, oh, here. Okay, so I'm AD user now, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
And then turn on tracer, gonna launch this one. And that's me.
Okay, good.
That's me. Yeah. So that is a real world scenario.
Okay.
As in the AD users logged into Idaptive as well.
Okay.
And of course, that is the user principal name being sent.
Is this a light federation? Can we configure between Centrify to Centrify?
You can, yes.
Oh, okay.
No, well, you mean, Ashok, did you mean that this light federation from Centrify to Centrify?
Yeah.
No. It will work, but that's not the intended. Remember the email thread?
Yeah.
That's not the intended use case, or people don't believe our CTO.
Not a real customer use case, you mean?
Yeah. Our CTO explicitly say
okay.
That's not a use case.
So whenever we want to this light federation, we have to use the adaptive then tenant and the Centrify tenant.
No. We as a, if I may, Nate can chime in if he wants. Basically, Centrify is not an IDP provider, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so then that if that's the case, we don't want to be the IDP, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
But we need
So
to test the light federation for every release, isn't it, Gordon?
I'm sorry?
We need to test this light federation feature for every release. So
of course. I mean, remember the number one priority is this light federation.
Yeah.
The number two priority is Okta as an IDP, right?
Mm-hmm.
Number three is ADFS as an IDP, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in all three, Centrify, we are not IDP, right?
Yeah. We are a service provider.
Yeah.
So we will have the IDP, the adaptive tenants, and also Centrify tenants for a lightweight testing every release, right? Lightweight federation testing.
One more time. In the case of lightweight for light federation, Idaptive is the
IDP.
Yeah. And we are the SP. This sometimes is confusing.
Yeah. We are always SP.
Yeah. We are always SP. Yeah.
Okay.
Terry, could I ask you a question about split legacy tenants? Mm-hmm. So what you went through is pretty much, what you went through manually happens when they split a legacy tenant, right? Mm-hmm. Like you create the federation or you set up the partner management on the Centrify side, and on the adaptive side, on the IDP, it creates that B2B app, right?
Yes.
Okay. So if it works for troubleshooting purposes, if it works one way, if it goes through the IDP, it does the authentication, but it stops where it fails, it says you don't have the authority, then that's probably, so it's on the IDP side, on the application side, right? either something's wrong with the application, it's not set up.
Come again, Gino. Can you?
Yeah. So I mean, as far as the like, I log into the service provider, and it reroutes to the IDP
Yes.
through Idaptive.
Yes.
It asks for username, password, but then as soon as you authenticate, it's supposed to route you back to the .NET, right? Back to sort of the Centrify side, right? The SP.
Yes. Yes.
And if that, so for troubleshooting, like if it fails, like, yeah, right there. If there is no application, for example, then there's no way to get back to the .NET, right?
If there is no application, what
like
do you mean?
So I guess in my case,
go on.
Oh no, so in my case, like we had some production tenants split. They were legacy tenants, and I could authenticate and everything goes through the IDP, but then as soon as I put in the name and password, it just says you don't have access to this application, or it may have been removed. So I'm assuming there is no application that it's trying to get to on the Idaptive side, right?
Okay, so that could be, if I may, I mean, that could be that this, when you say legacy, has it been split, right? It has been split, right?
Yes.
And if it's split, this light federation has been automatically set up, and the application will be there already. That application. And that application on the Idaptive side literally represent the PAS portal, right? So if you go back, so from a Idaptive side, that application, that web application is literally the PAS portal. Right? If you look at Nate's chat, right? You see what I mean? If it is set up properly, when you click on that Centrify web app on the Idaptive side, you will land it on the Centrify PAS portal. And if you go to try to log into, and that's called IDP initiative. If you go to the Centrify portal, you try to log into Centrify portal, it will try to get authenticated from Idaptive side, and then you end up at the Centrify portal.
Right, but yeah, okay, but right now it doesn't, so I think
then there's the bug. There is something wrong somewhere, right? But I believe our previous our split tenant testing verified that it works, right?
Oh yeah, I mean I have got I've seen it working, but I guess in my case with these, I guess with the way it's migrated, maybe I got to bring it up with the ops guys, but they're saying it's something wrong with the apps. But looking on the Idaptive side, I don't see the app there, so I'm assuming that either wasn't set up right or wasn't migrated properly.
Or
do we have to create that?
Guess.
Oh, go ahead.
Terry, go ahead.
Okay. If the message you see is the app, you don't have permission to launch the app, or the app has been removed, then yes, my first guess would also be, however the partner management setup, either the B2B app really isn't there by the app key from federation side, or the federation is on that side is using a different app key. Either way, there's a disconnect there.
Right.
And with migration, as far as I know, this setup that I just showed you, it was done by the tool. And that's why I guess you guys are testing it, right? But when that message happens, that would be the first thing I look at, is you look at the Idaptive side too. I think you said you actually saw it, right? If that app with that app key is not even there, then well, that's the answer. As in why it is broken. Now, how that was broken, that's the next question.
Yeah, I only see one B2B app, and just looking at the details, it doesn't look like it routes back to the .NET.
Any other questions? I just saw Nate, you typed the questions some time ago.
No, I think they're all
answered that
answered.
already?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Okay, any other things? If not, then that's all I have for you today.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Terry.
Federation
Next
and
week
you
we
very
have
much.
it on a Tuesday night.
Thank you. Can you
Thanks,
send
Terry.
Yeah,
Oh.
Thursday night.
You're
I mean.
welcome.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, see you guys again on Thursday night.
yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so what are we going to cover on Thursday night?
So this big training, I'm gonna go back to some basics already, which is like similar thing that I gave you last time.
Okay.
Then
okay.
I'll go into also the practical side of things, as in setting things up.
Okay. Okay. So we are going to maybe even repeat what we have gone through, right?
Almost.
Yeah. Okay.
I might make some slight changes.
Yeah.
Mhm.
No, this is cool for the team.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. This is good. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thanks, Terry.
You're
Thanks,
welcome.
Terry.